And welcome back, everyone, to yet another edition of Going for Two, presented by our good friends at Home Field Apparel. I am your host of this show. My name is Matt Brown. I publish the Extra Points newsletter. I'm based here in absolutely beautiful Chicago, Illinois. I'm joined here, as always, by Bryan Fischer, my colleague and co-host at the D1 Ticker Extended Universe. Bryan, it is now, we've done 4 weeks of college football. In the last 2 midweek shows that we've done, we sat down because somebody got fired. And lo and behold, it's recording this here on a Tuesday afternoon, and some more people got fired. It's still not October. We're operating on this is our third now, not just FBS opening, but P5 opening, right?
Third Power 5 opening in a row, and I believe I posed the question to you if there would be an opening this weekend, and you kind of demurred there, and then you know what? Lo and behold, Georgia Tech moves on from Geoff Collins. So, yeah, busy week on the coaching carousel, such as it is, but that's kind of life nowadays. And you know, speaking of which, I mean, you had a great thing on Extra Points. A lot of these ads firing their coaches in September. You know what? This is a decision that should have been made well before today.
And it's funny because I was kind of inferring this when I've been making this argument about, hey, if you fire somebody September 15th, you should have done something before. And the question I've been positing these past 2 weeks is, well, what are you going to do differently because your process before gave you the wrong answer? Well, Georgia Tech's case, the answer is, well, we fired the guy that made that decision too. And this is not that I wouldn't say that you should do this for Nebraska because, you know, Trev Alberts has been there for 8 months. I am saying you should probably do this for Arizona State, but for different reasons. But Georgia Tech has decided to completely clear house. Todd Stansbury's gone. They're going to allegedly, at least the plan, as I understand it today, based on the university president, looks like read from a note card and then exit stage, bounced from the stage. So we're going to try to get an AD first, and then we're going to get a new coach. And this is a unique situation, I think, in a lot of respects. And I do want to spend some time talking about the AD chair. I want to talk about where you might go from the coaching search, although I generally think that's the least interesting part of these things because that's what everybody else on the internet does. I want to start maybe with this. The entire general thesis of the Geoff Collins era, as I understood it from an idiot outsider, was you want to have a guy come in here and talk about rebuilding a brand, right? Nope. Georgia Tech under Paul Johnson was a lot of things. It was beloved by college football hipsters and nerds and film people. It wasn't cool. They weren't recruiting at an especially high level, and that bothered a lot of people because Georgia Tech, in case you are unaware, is in Atlanta, one of the greatest concentrations of college football talent in the entire country. And they were getting out recruited by very ambitious Mountain West programs, essentially. So you have this guy come in who is Mr. Waffle House, Mr. Atlanta, doing everything about talking about enhancing the school's brand and exposure and presence in Atlanta, and everything's Atlanta this. And things didn't work out. So let me ask you this. Do you think that calculus was wrong and the execution just didn't work out, or was it a bad idea in the first place?
No, I think I mean, it's just so difficult to kind of move away from that triple option that Paul Johnson was running. You know, you're talking about wholesale roster changes that you kind of have to go through, and you're right. You know, that there was kind of the thinking that, you know what, let's juice this brand up. You know, like we are in this great location. Why are we kind of falling behind? And I think Geoff Collins had some good ideas surrounding that. I think the execution was a little bit lacking, and honestly, it was kind of brand building before there was any substance to kind of put behind that brand. You know, I think that was kind of the biggest thing that I noticed is it's great that you're out there and you got a bunch of phones and you're being crazy with Waffle House and you got these hats and you're doing all these things and kind of gimmicky, and you just kind of saw that as the tenure progressed kind of fade away, just because there was no substance behind it. And I think people kind of saw right through that, and that was part of the issue. This is a results driven business, and there were no results there at Georgia Tech, and if anything, they kind of got worse. You know, especially compared to some of their ACC peers. Those blowouts, those not being competitive in those games, that hurts the brand more than anything. And I think Georgia Tech kind of came around to that idea.
You can't meme your way out of going 4-8 and being a kind of boring 4-8. And it's funny you mentioned, hey, listen, the transition out of triple option is difficult if you're trying to run something very different. I saw David Hale over at ESPN make this point. I hadn't thought about it this way before, but it makes a ton of sense. The timing for all of this was also terrible, because if you are moving away from a triple option oriented offense or an air raid offense or something, or a run and shoot or something else where your roster is very scheme oriented, It's a little bit easier to do that in a post-transfer portal era where you could potentially turn over 20% of your roster in 1 year. And that wasn't what Georgia Tech could do. So it took them, 2 years to kind of rechange the roster. And then the team sucked. And then the portal opened. And just as their best skill position players were kind of maturing, they all left. And because the team had been asked for the last 2.5 years, but they couldn't meme their way into having any juice to bring people in from the portal. And that's not necessarily Geoff Collins' fault, but you're right. Results driven business. Like there's something to the fact that this could not have been transition and how everything was set up. It wasn't really timed right. Is there something to that, right?
I think so. You look at what Lincoln Riley has been able to do and bringing in 25, 26 transfers, and really being able to flip a roster that used to win 4 wins to now, let's face it, they're in college football playoff contingent. I think the timing of a roster flip has changed dramatically, not just because of the fact that you can get into the portal, but because of the roster flexibility now is so much greater. You used to have that hard cap of 25, and that really kind of limited your flexibility because you did want to build towards the future, even if you wanted to kind of make some roster adjustments and maybe beef up in certain positions that were under recruited with your predecessor. But now it's so much easier. Now you can change out an entire position group if you want, like that is capable of some of these new coaches. So I think it, just was kind of compounding errors there at Georgia Tech. And I think Geoff Collins, had some good ideas initially. It's just kind of the execution just did not kind of follow through. And, being in the ACC, as much as we might talk about the ACC being down, it's you're still competing against, coaches that know what they're doing. And they were able to kind of exploit that quite a bit. I think it does help the attractiveness of Georgia Tech and just in terms of, being competitive in the ACC moving forward. But, this is a unique job. And I think not understanding some of the uniqueness that goes around and into it was kind of their first big misstep right away.
Why don't we talk a little bit about what makes this unique? And then I think we can talk maybe a little bit more about the administrative side, since that's one of the things that makes this show different from everyone else kind of pontificating about who might take this gig. Georgia Tech has a couple of things on paper that would make you think this team should be good. They've won a national championship in college football in our lifetime. Now, we are old. You can look at the video here. You can see my gray hairs. I'm 35. I don't really remember the championship, but it did happen. It was not in the Paleolithic era of college football. It has a history. Like in addition to being very good, then the Georgia Tech used to win lots of SEC games. They were competitive nationally for decades. And there are people that have lived in Atlanta for a long time and remember Georgia Tech not being a team that might make the Birmingham Bowl, but a capital T thing. You are also located, as we said before, in Atlanta. You are in a state that is, at this point, probably the 4th best state in producing elite college football talent or NFL caliber talent. It's ahead of Ohio. And not only that, but you are within, depending on how bad traffic is, 2 hours from most of those players. They're not all going to go to Georgia. They're not all going to go to Auburn or Alabama or Ohio State. So there's local talent that's right there. And you have an academic brand that means something. So on paper, you look at all these things and you say, hey, you got a P5 budget too. This team should be good. Why haven't they been good in a long time? Besides the fact that they've maybe made some poor coaching hires, Brian, can you posit a reason why Georgia Tech, despite all those advantages that I just said, might struggle to reach its football potential?
Well, I think you can kind of look back towards, the ethos of the school, in terms of investment, in terms of making football a priority. I don't think it really has been. I think Paul Johnson did his best to kind of take over the program and shepherd it and try to move it with his sheer will of force. And obviously that ran into some issues with both the previous administrations and the fan base in terms of just how he tried to run his program. But honestly, I think over the years, this is a team that does have those baked in advantages, but just have not been able to quite put it all together in a line in the right time frame. That's the we've talked about it how many times in this podcast. Alignment between football coach and AD and your school president, and I think that's kind of why really this entire move is being made right now. Is that they want to kind of do something to make sure that alignment is set, in a much better way than it ever has been, there at Georgia Tech. And so that's part of the reason, not finding the right quarterbacks, that's contributing to the factor, playing the option offense does kind of limit your ceiling a little bit, just in terms of, truly competing nationally. Yeah, they've been to the Orange Bowl running that system, but actually being a consistent team from year to year that is competing for the top of the ACC, that did kind of limit them a little bit. But you got to also keep in mind that this is an engineering school.
This is what I was getting to here. It's not called Georgia Liberal Arts. This is Georgia Tech, brother.
I think this is a university that kind of views some of their peers as your Northwesterns and your Vanderbilts of the world, certainly, and even higher caliber schools than that. And they still want to play major Power 5 football, but you got to take calculus. You got to take these massive engineering classes. You're not getting a BA in basket weaving at Georgia Tech. That is not a case. Is it easier than some other places like a Stanford to get kids in? Yes, absolutely. I think that is something that the new coaches will understand, that we can get some talent coming in, but they're still going to have to do well in the classroom. And I think you can see that if you look over the history of Georgia Tech and some of the transfers they've had going out, I think that maybe they simply couldn't hack it in terms of the rigorous academic load that you're going to face at Georgia Tech. That's something you got to work around. And Paul Johnson was able to kind of find those right guys that did want that and could play football at an ACC caliber level. And it's a difficult and tricky spot that they've kind of got to navigate here. But the bottom line is this is a university that does take the academics seriously, and that can put a bit of a limiter on the football program itself.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of the general fan base, and I think college football writers struggle with this a little bit too. Being a academically demanding school, it is not necessarily we just look at the U.S. World Report rankings when we're talking about college football. So the dirty little secret here is you got the NCAA minimums for admitting an athlete, and schools are then welcome to add a higher bar to admit an athlete. And then there are differences in curriculum that the people take when they actually get there. So very broadly speaking, most Big Ten schools and most Pac-12 schools and many ACC schools have curriculum and entrance requirements that are above that of the NCAA minimum. It's why most of those schools generally don't recruit a lot of JUCO athletes. You don't need, now I'm not saying that you need to have a 29 under ACT to play football at Ohio State. That's clearly not the case. And that was especially not the case in the early 1990s. But there are, it is different than it might be at Marshall. And that's not me saying like Marshall's a bad place. Different schools have different institutional needs, right? Then once you get there, and by the way, though, how difficult it can be to admit somebody is not completely correlated with how good the school is. The what I've heard from coaches over the years and from other people in administrations is like in the Big Ten, generally the school that's hardest to get somebody admitted to is Wisconsin. Wisconsin's a great school, but is it a lot better than Northwestern or Michigan? I wouldn't say that. It's probably a little bit below, but in terms of the math requirements and in terms of the alignment, so to speak, between administration and the athletic department, that's a difficult school to get into. One of the challenges at any place is math. Right. And what satisfies a math requirement, how much math somebody has to take. There's math that you could put somebody in that is more accessible to a liberal arts major in other places. And just like you said, at Georgia Tech, you got to take calculus. There's not a way to hide somebody who is less prepared. Even if the admissions office says, sure, you're a special admit, you still got to pass that class. And maybe the least demanding major there might be business administration, which is not a beanbag kind of major. That is, I would say, from a curriculum standpoint, one of the most challenging situations in FBS, outside of the service academies, outside of Stanford. But
you mentioned
up there with
Stanford
anybody
there.
else. Yeah.
I think there's a difficulty in terms of where the bar is the highest. Is it getting kids in the door, or is it once they're in the door? Is it the bar being high after that? I think Stanford is a great example. One of the highest bars, I think in all of FBS is those Stanford admissions and the admission process. I think if David Shaw had hair, he would be pulling it out, just knowing that it does kind of limit.
That's why he doesn't anymore. He used to look like me.
Yeah. So that's part of the reason. But I think if you talk with Stanford athletes, yes, your Andrew Lucks that take I forget what kind of engineering degree he pursued, but there are some that definitely kind of go after those massive degrees. But I think generally on campus at Stanford, it's a little bit easier once you've done the front end work to get into a place like that. The academic rigor. I'm not saying that it's light or anything like that, but I'm just saying, like, in terms of course loads and things that you can kind of go through on a daily basis, how you craft your schedules. It can be a little bit easier than, say, a Georgia Tech, where you do have to kind of have certain requirements to hit certain degrees that you have to take in those classes. And this is something that is different at pretty much every place around the country, right? This is why all these schools are unique, and why you do go to get these massive degrees. And so I think it's just unique to college football in terms of where is that bar? Is it the guys coming in the door, or is it after they've already stepped through and they're on campus that you really have to kind of work with them and kind of massage things a little bit to where you not only have players that can play, but you have players that are academically eligible as well.
Yeah, this is a great point. This is different at other it's a different dynamic at lots of different schools. It's one that's been an issue at Georgia Tech for as long as I've followed college football and even researching and writing about college football. Like, I'm not going to profess to be a Tech expert, but in my book, there was a big section about Tech's departure from the SEC and what the program looked like. And this was, the kind of book on Bobby Dodd, their great coach, at their most successful era, was that they had Dodd luck because they didn't have the size. They didn't have the recruiting flexibility or the roster flexibility. Dodd was very famous among coaches for not running people off, which is what everybody did and what most people still do. So they didn't have the dudes, and they kind of won. If you were somebody that was not inclined to look at Tech favorably, you would say that they got lucky, or they were very good at engineering a 13-10 kind of win. And when he left, Tech's had a couple of really good years, but I mean, I got Sports Reference pulled up on another tab right here. They've never been consistent outside of like a 4-year run with George O'Leary. And that might mean with Paul Johnson, you made the Orange Bowl a couple of times and you went 7-6 a lot. And you were a absolute pain in the ass 7-6 that nobody wanted to play till kind of the end of that era when people finally started to figure it out after 10 years. But you were 7-6 under Chan Gailey. It was just a different kind of football. You were 7-6. Actually, you were worse than that under Bill Lewis. Like that. That's kind of what things are. So I say all this to say, like, I don't think Georgia Tech's an impossible job because I don't think the ACC is full of behemoths at every level. And I think there's lots of different ways to win football games besides just accumulating 45 5-star players. If you want to win the college football playoff in a 14 playoff era, that's the only way to win. But that's not what everyone here is trying to do. And I think if you ran into a Georgia Tech fan and said, hey, we want to sit down here as a department, we want to be not boring, and we want to compete for the Peach Bowl or the Chick-fil-A Bowl and at a special season a little bit more than that, and we want to beat Georgia 2 out of 10 years or 3 out of 10 years, I think they'd say, hell yeah, that sounds awesome. And I don't think that's impossible to do if you get not just the right coach, but the right AD and the right alignment, right? That seems reasonable.
Yeah, and I think especially at a place like Georgia Tech, which Bobby Dodd Stadium is a great atmosphere when they got things going. Like the people in Atlanta do support that team. Like I think there is a lot of support for Georgia Tech. Operating, I guess, at a higher level, which they do in a lot of the other sports. I think that it's taken a while. Certainly,
awesome at volleyball.
They're great at volleyball. They have a lot of Olympic support success. You look at basketball. Certainly back in the day, they made a couple of runs there in the tournament. I know that's been another source of frustration, amongst Yellow Jackets fans, is just not having consistency with basketball as well. I think some of the issues that kind of haunt the football program also, are, kind of plague the basketball program in terms of consistency, and not finding the right coach is key in both sports to kind of navigate that. But yeah, it's definitely a school that, based on those inherent advantages, they should be punching just a little bit above their weight, even with some of the restrictions that they have to operate under.
Let's talk about those restrictions for a second, about the first hire that Georgia Tech needs to make. And defining what makes a good athletic director, I think, is honestly really challenging because unlike with a good football coach, you can look at the scoreboard. And ultimately, like, that's very clearly, able to, you can define that. That's in, they put it in the paper, there's standings, and that's ultimately what most coaches are evaluated on. For being an AD, not only you have a gajillion programs, sometimes you hire the coaches. Sometimes, as you very well know, and maybe our more astute listeners know, sometimes the AD doesn't really hire the coach, right? Sometimes that's a regent or a booster or a search firm or some other party. But that AD also has to do fundraising. That AD has to find staffers for all different levels of this apparatus and set a vision. And I think in many ways you can look at Tech and say, wow, they have been successful and articulated a vision, what they want to do in many Olympic sports. They have raised money. I have been told that they haven't raised as much money as maybe some people think that they should, or maybe what they need. But that's been what's happening here. But it's difficult to achieve the rest of your department goals if football's really not working, if you're not at a place where those other sports are money cannons. And that's not really the kind of place that Georgia Tech is. There's a lot of Tech alumni. They're not all super plugged into sports. And a lot of the sidewalk potential people you could get as sidewalk alumni are Georgia fans. Or honestly, in Atlanta these days, they're like Ohio State fans because they moved to Georgia from Columbus or from Toledo or from any other SEC place.
Well, yeah, it is the great melting pot there in Atlanta among especially the SEC fan bases. But you're right, increasingly among some of those Big Ten schools and from schools up north. But I think in terms of what the next AD is looking at and inheriting, you look at this football only, just in terms of football spending. This is one of the small, lower resourced, football programs, in the ACC. They're in the bottom four, depending on what year it is and who's doing what in terms of facilities upgrades. But like I would say, generally they're on the lower end, and that needs to change. If they want to make this a priority to keep increasing things. I think this is not only being in Atlanta and all the benefits that brings, but from a corporate sponsorship standpoint, from just an eyeball standpoint, that this is a job that has a whole lot of baked in advantages that a Wake Forest or even an NC State does not have. And so I think when you look at some of your peers that you're competing with in your conference, I think the Georgia Tech job stacks up pretty favorably. I think this will be one that a lot of people are going to keep their eyes opening. I wouldn't be surprised if an existing AD is going to be the choice, just because they do want somebody that has that experience and can bring some life into this program. But the bottom line is, for all those things that you can take advantage of, they have not been yet necessarily at Georgia Tech. And so I think alignment will be key in making sure that you can say, we've got to fundraise. We've got to pump some money into the football program. We've got to make sure that staff resources are there in terms of academic support. That's a big thing. Making sure that we have tutors lined up, making sure that our athletic training staff is top notch, and sports performance, which they do have a pretty good program there. Facilities, another thing that probably needs some upgrades here and there. I remember, I think it was a couple of years ago at the end of the Paul Johnson era, they upgraded their locker rooms, and it was like, oh, this is so good, and they were kind of still behind the times. So you kind of got to take it all and evaluate it, and that's something that the next AD is going to have to do.
Yeah, actually, I think the first 3 years of whoever takes over Tech is going to be this really fascinating case study, because I've written a lot that facilities don't matter as much as coaches and maybe some like outside, like regions and everything, think that they might for recruiting. But you can't be so far behind everybody else that becomes a distracting talking point. As an example, if you're in a warm weather place and you don't have an indoor practice facility, if you don't have a place where you can go where it's not going to be 104 degrees, or you're playing on a 40-yard field, that is something that would set you apart. If you are in the bottom three of the ACC, you might need to make some changes. But given that you have a limited amount of rich people right now and a limited revenue stream, whether that's from broadcast television or anything else, or Tech starting like this venture capital fund to invest in sports startups, and who knows if that works or anything. But you also now have the NIL component. So I think this is going to be an interesting case study. Do you try to take your limited resources and go move very aggressively into direct compensation for people currently on the roster, or to help people get to the roster? Or do you put that into your infrastructure that people can't necessarily see, which can be very valuable? Your dietitians, your trainers, your mental health support specialists. Or do you put that in the stuff that people can see? Or do you put the stuff that people can see, even if it doesn't really matter, as a signaling device that you're serious, to get other people to kick in money? That's a complicated question. I mean, we've both heard from ADs that have said, maybe this facility project that we would have done in 2017, maybe we don't do it now and we put that money somewhere else. It will be, I'm not sure what makes the most sense for what tech. So I imagine everyone interviewing for this gig, I don't think you necessarily have to be an Atlanta person or an ACC person or a Southerner. I think you do need to be able to have some experience with universities that have demanding academic standards. You need to be able to speak professor, speak faculty, speak to that constituency, because that's part of your gig. And you need to know how to win football games without having as much talent as all of your opponents. A lot of particular ways to skin that. I mean, or for that coach, right? A lot of particular ways to skin that cat. I want to talk about who some of those coaches may or may not be, because I know we both have some strong opinions about that. But before we do, I do want to quickly highlight somebody else that knows a thing or two about sending a culture and providing something for folks, even if it's not the most expensive thing on the market. It's not a great segue, but I'm not Alex Kirshner. Let's talk about Home Field Apparel. Home Field Apparel, our title sponsor, the patron of this program, a major pillar of our community, of weird college football Twitter community, of appreciating just weird college sports stuff. That's Home Field. They make shirts. They make sweatshirts. You've heard me talk about them a gajillion times. I'm wearing an Ohio State shirt right now. This is a Going for Two podcast. I'm wearing one that says, because I couldn't go for three. We got the Go Tops right there with the monster from the depths of hell that walked off the set of Sesame Street to terrorize.
Hey, now Big Red's coming off a 73-0 win, so I think he's doing all right.
He's entitled to that. I know. I feel bad about rubbing in how bad FIU is, given our ties to that program. But yeah, Western Kentucky doing pretty good. Ohio State would have gone for three, I think, if they could have against Wisconsin at the end of touchdowns. They make all this great stuff. They're dropping my favorite G5 program this week, the East Carolina Pirates. Purple and gold is a tough color combination. I don't look good in it. I'm going to buy some of this stuff anyway, because I deeply love the Pirates and the connections to the Brown and Figueiredo household. We will be supporting them. They just dropped the first conference swag. They have the vintage Big Sky logo, which I joked is the greatest logo that looks like a Boy Scout merit badge, or maybe like a 2014 like SB Nation logo. It is pretty cool. They got a bunch of great stuff, and you can get that. You can support all the mid majors. You can support the high majors. You can support the Division 2s and the Division 3s at homefieldapparel.com. And when you do, if you haven't already, get your friend who hasn't done it yet, because you listening to the show, you probably have. Use promo code Extra Points to save 15% off that order. Listen, fellas, friends, we're getting very close to hoodie season wherever you live, unless you live in Texas, and then hoodie season's coming hopefully a little bit later. Make sure you're prepared. Get some very soft, very snuggly stuff from homefieldapparel.com. We got to talk about who they're going to hire, because we've just established, hey, this is a unique gig. You have some geographic advantages. You've got some historical advantages. You have a league that's not impossible to finish in the top three. It's going to be hard to beat Clemson, hard to beat Florida State if they get their shit together, which it looks like they might be, but it's not the AFC West or whatever. But difficult place to recruit. You don't have a ton of money. You have a weird university constituency situation. Who's the guy that everybody seems to want to hire right now, Brian?
Well, that'd be the prime time, Deion Sanders.
What do you think about that?
I think that is a disconnection to knowing the university, and for a lot of the reasons that we just talked about. I totally get why you want to connect, in a vacuum, Georgia Tech to somebody like Deion Sanders, right? It's like, yeah. We understand he was an Atlanta star. He resonates in that city like probably no other athlete, maybe even outside Michael Vick, perhaps would come close. Given the ending there, maybe not so much, but there's just like nobody in terms of that star power that would resonate not only with folks our age, but I think even a little bit younger, especially now with what he's been able to do there at Jackson State, landing the nation's #1 recruit. You think, all right, well, if you just take him and you add the star power of Atlanta and meld those two things together, yeah, it does make perfect sense from the outside. But I just don't think that Deion Sanders, if he's looking to make the leap, to a Power 5 gig, which it does sound like he wants to, really is going to want to get into the fights about how many special admits of recruits that he wants to get in. Like I just don't think that's necessarily what he's going to be looking for in the next program. Maybe he just wants to move back to Atlanta. I totally get that, but I think the disconnection between what I think Deion ultimately wants to do, which is compete for championships. So I think he's made no secret about that in terms of his aspirations, and where he wants to go. I don't necessarily think that Georgia Tech, at least in this phase right now, would really kind of fit what he brings to the table. I think there are a lot of good candidates though, but I think everybody's focusing there on Deion being connected to this job, and I'm just not kind of seeing it from the administration standpoint, from the school standpoint, from the kind of inherent restrictions versus if an Auburn when Auburn comes open, I think he'll find that a little bit more amenable to taking that job versus this one.
Yeah, I want to preface. I think you're onto something here. I want to preface this by saying, like everybody else, I do not know exactly who's going to make a good football coach. Stuff that looks like it makes a lot of sense on paper.
Has that not been reinforced by the recent coaching cycles, right?
Right, and so I want to beat that in again, right? Like, so you can look at the data, but football is a weird thing, and sometimes Scott Frost doesn't work out, or Harbaugh almost doesn't work out until he does. And I understand that. Hey, listen, if you are somebody that believes in the general argument that Geoff Collins was making about how it's important to lean into this brand and rebrand what you're trying to do and create a different identity around Georgia Tech, there is nobody in the entire country, even if you poach somebody from the NFL, that could do that better than Deion Sanders. If you thought the problem was execution, the idea was good, this is your guy, who's done that enormously well at Jackson State. I have to admit, like, I was a pretty big skeptic of him working out at Jackson State. And by all means, even though it has you take the bad with the good, and the good has been overwhelmingly more than the bad. And they're going to be very good again this year. And I think if Deion Sanders went to Georgia Tech, their ability to acquire talent, particularly in the transfer portal, assuming they could get everybody they needed to be successful in school, would go up quite a bit. I want to be careful how I say this here. Like, if you're going to hire Deion Sanders, I think that what you want to do is have an institution that is prepared to help mitigate some of the excesses in PR or in messaging or anything else that might come with that. So as an example, the story that I think a lot about is when Deion Sanders had his very first game at Jackson State. They're hosting like some Division II team. And the main story from that game, if you remember correctly, was not anything that happened on the field. It was Deion Sanders freaking out about some people stealing something from the locker room. And Jackson State, their sports information department, and as an institution, they were not prepared for anything close to the amount of press and attention they were going to be getting with bringing on Deion Sanders. And so, like, that suddenly all went to that guy. And there are very good things that come from that. And there are things that will make university administrators' hair fall out. And there are things that you can get away with at Jackson State and with Jackson State's peer institutions that will be different at PWIs in the ACC. And I say this not to say that like one is better than the other, just that there's different attention and different constituencies and different people who have different issues with behavior. So I think you want to be at a place where you have enough of an infrastructure to protect and help your football coach do what he does really, really well, and help limit the possibilities of doing, right? Like, to have a 2-day news cycle of you flipping out at a reporter at media day because they called you Deion instead of coach is not a thing that's going to play as well in the ACC with a much larger press corps and a much more skeptical populace. Now, I could say all that, and you could say at Auburn and go, but that's like the most dysfunctional environment and booster culture in college football. Like, it's a place where Deion Sanders could win a national championship. It's a place where he can invite a congressional investigation, maybe both. So I see things both ways. I understand the appeal, but I think I would share your concern for somebody that that would probably not be who I would go for. I do agree with my friend Richard Johnson, who runs Sports Illustrated. Like, if you do want to lean into changing your culture a little bit, Georgia Tech's never had a black football coach. And there are plenty of other black football coaches who are not Deion Sanders and who are not just recruiters, but talented schematic minds and administrators in their own right who may be a better fit for what Georgia Tech is trying to do, that may be something you decide as a staff, as an institution, to make a priority.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're totally right. Especially, just taking on the presence of Deion is going to be a little bit different for a place like Auburn versus a place like Georgia Tech. And, I think it is going to be interesting to see what kind of, names kind of get in the mix here. I mean, I think I've already heard that, Dell McGee's name, Brian McClendon over there at Georgia, understanding that those are two guys that I think are going to be in the mix for several openings just based on their success there with the Bulldogs. Does Georgia Tech want to kind of poach from their in-state rival, knowing it is a much different job? We'll see how the interview process is going to play out. I think, Charles Huff right now is a name that I've heard as well. He does kind of bring, that Alabama pedigree, having success there at Marshall in a quick time frame. Been there for a couple of years, so he understands, kind of how to get a program off the ground. I think that would be a big fit. I would be curious. I think that the first name to my mind though is actually kind of Jamie Chadwell. If you want to kind of at least understand that you got to maximize talent at a place like that. He's done that at Coastal, and I think in the ACC, his system, especially with a good quarterback like he has now in Grayson McCall. I think it could work. I think you win quite a few games, and it's at least a link to kind of the past and what Georgia Tech has found success with there. Although it's in a much different environment. I think that running that option and his system, the way he calls plays, with upgraded talent from not only Metro Atlanta but from the state of Georgia, from the South, reaching down, grabbing more Florida athletes. I think that could be a pretty dynamite conversation, but it's all going to come down to essentially what the AD hire is. And I think that will tell us a lot in terms of the direction that Georgia Tech is looking for. If they get somebody that is, very progressive AD and somebody who is, kind of football first, then maybe some of those other candidates that we think of, like a Deion Sanders could become a little bit more part of the reality in terms of the coaching search itself. If not, I think if it's a traditional candidate, maybe somebody, who does have that traditional experience as maybe a group of 5 AD, maybe we're looking at a more, straightforward kind of coaching search.
I like Jamie Chadwell a lot just because I like watching that football team and the culture that has been built at Coastal, which feels maybe not totally congruent with Georgia Tech. This is something I would say with love. What we see on the outside about Coastal Carolina is it is a delightfully and fun but unrefined kind place.
Well, I mean, Jamie's a Southern guy. He's from Tennessee. He embraces the life of the mullets. He embraces the life down there in Myrtle. So
professional wrestlers and going through tables, and I right and not to say you can't do that. Not to say at Georgia Tech you have to go in there and talk about Aristotle but like you could potentially do those things. They are fun to watch. That is a more modern offspring of the Paul Johnson offense that tries to do similar things, but maybe not the exact same thing that you've done for a decade.
Yeah, and I think Jamie, along with Deion, are probably two of the more intriguing candidates throughout this entire coaching carousel. I think Jamie's interviewed with a couple positions here or there these last couple of years as Coastal has kind of risen up the ranks and won the Sun Belt. And I think there's some hesitancy among some ADs, hiring somebody who really is not recruited at a Power 5 level, has not been at an institution like that, in a major decision-making way. And the same is true with Deion, but Deion brings so much more than kind of the outside of just the football realm that you also have to consider. So I think those are two of the really intriguing names, I think, in the coaching carousel, because there's not that kind of one true hot candidate that every school is just going to be fawning themselves over. There's no kind of Tom Herman from a couple of years ago or a Scott Frost from a couple of years ago. And, maybe that's a good thing, because
I was about to say,
we've seen how those have turned out recently.
Those guys haven't. And some of the people that we kind of laughed at as like the fourth tier hires ended up turning out pretty well, which just goes to show we don't know shit. So maybe it's good to hire somebody off the beaten path, because the beaten path hasn't necessarily produced great results. Maybe I'll throw in a note here in the show notes to Richard's piece. Just real quick, a couple other people that he has suggested besides Charles Huff. Marshall has struggled since beating Notre Dame, but he's a new guy.
They've been out without some key players as well.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think that was a necessarily turnkey win 11 games kind of situation anyway, which is fine. Florida State's Alex Atkins, I think, has done a pretty good job. Ryan Walters is doing a good job at Illinois. And then Richard says, hey, you might look at the NFL a little bit too. There's a couple of assistants for the Rams with Eric Henderson and Thomas Brown. I think they both have Georgia ties. and might be a fit as well.
Well, I don't know if Richard mentioned it, but Pep Hamilton, a lot of NFL experience. It was at Stanford for a long time, been at Michigan, some other place. So he knows, kind of what that kind of academic and athletic component is going to be. And I would imagine you're going to hear Bill O'Brien's name come up quite a bit for Power 5 openings, this offseason as well.
No, you definitely will. Bill O'Brien's representation has not been shy about letting people know that Bill O'Brien is available for jobs. That's always the other kind of weird thing about this whole, just as a news consumer at this cycle, right? Because agents and search firms and those third parties are often the sources for this kind of information. And that isn't to say that information is wrong, but we also have to evaluate, hey, if you see a guy that you're a little confused by that seems to pop up in every one of these searches, there's getting a lot of reporters tweeting about it, you might have to think for a second, I wonder who's benefiting from that. One of the, of course, side effects that happens during the coaching search season, and it might be a little bit weird without an obvious gigantic school leading the market. A lot of people are going to get raises from this world. People who are not necessarily looking for another job, but maybe it needs to appear in public that they are. So
I agree with what you're hinting about there with Bill O'Brien, but I think the track record, certainly what he was able to do at Penn State does speak for itself. I mean, he developed.
I don't think he's a bad football coach. Yeah,
so he developed a Heisman Trophy winner. I think his gruff edges, if you will term it as that, is going to be a little bit off-putting to some programs, but others will embrace that kind of aspect too. So I think there's kind of some things that you got to take give and take as part of these coaching searches, and there will be enough that there will be an intriguing enough candidate list for all of them. That's for sure.
That is true. So my hope, my Pollyannish hope, is that nobody gets fired next week. Not that I don't enjoy spending some time digging into specific, and it does work well for the news cycle to kind of space this out and only have one school each week. It would be nice if maybe we had a week where that didn't happen. I'm knocking on wood. I'm going to call my shot. I think we're going to go 2 weeks before the next person gets fired.
That is bold. I'm not going to agree with you.
Okay. That's fine. That's fine. And I'm not saying that this isn't because people in the hot seat don't deserve it. I'm just saying that, hey, maybe the ball bounces a certain way, or it takes another extra week for someone's check to clear before you can move something here. That is my educated hypothesis. We will have other things to talk about. One of the things that, speaking of recruiting and fit and alignment and everything, Brian, you recently had another episode of your HeadCoachU where you talked with Bronco Mendenhall about some of these similar things. A guy that is going to be mentioned, probably not for Auburn, but maybe for Georgia Tech.
You know what? He's talked quite a bit about the academic component. Certainly was there at Virginia. I think his name has.
I've already seen it, for being honest. Yeah.
I've seen his name pop up here and there in terms of various candidate lists and all that. And I think it would be intriguing a little bit to him. Maybe not quite the cultural fit there at Metro Atlanta than maybe some other spots that might come up in this cycle. But he could definitely get in the mix. And I think he would do a good job there. Knowing those limitations, knowing how much development is going to be a big thing at Georgia Tech. But this week we kind of talked about recruiting, which is obviously the lifeblood of any program. And it was great to hear some of his stories, some of the things that he wishes were different in terms of offering scholarships and all that. It was great to kind of nail him down in terms of what is that process like from watching the film to how you kind of offer kids, what that means at programs like BYU versus Virginia and others that he's been at. So if you want to kind of get into the weeds of recruiting, by all means, listen into HeadCoachU, subscribe wherever you get this here podcast. We had an earlier episode about NIL and kind of governance changes. So we're rolling right along, and we'll get some guests going here not in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I think what we may actually end up doing is if you are subscribed to this podcast, which you should be, especially if you're listening to this 40 minutes into it, you may see a couple of HeadCoachUs pop up in that feed. We're trying to kind of cross promote a lot of the stuff that we're doing across our different little audio projects. And then we are going to sit back here, and not that I don't enjoy talking to you, Brian, but also try to take the time in our very busy schedules to bring on some other folks with unique perspectives about what's happening, and maybe beyond just college football too, because there's a lot of other things going on that we have maybe been a little bit remiss, even if we've been doing that on Connect and on Extra Points and other places. This week on Extra Points, I sat down and interviewed a bunch of different athletes in the A10. I talked to folks at LaSalle and at Dayton, talked to a couple of athletic directors, talked to folks at St. Louis about what NIL looks like for people that don't have gigantic collectives supporting them. Interesting thing about that is that nobody I talked to has done a single deal with any kind of online marketplace. There's nothing on Open Doors, nothing with No Cap, nothing with Influencer, and on that back end, they've all found deals in different places. And we talked about what that means and how the conference is trying to support them some more. And on Monday, I wrote a big missive from our kind of jokey posting world, where I looked at the funniest team that each Power 5 opponent has never beaten, because I forgot about that. I mean, I didn't realize this until over the weekend. When Middle Tennessee beat Miami, that wasn't the first time they've done that. They're 3-0 against Miami. Western Kentucky has multiple wins against Miami and no losses. So I looked this up for everybody.
It was great seeing all the pre-flights that everybody had lost to. Yeah.
Those in the YMCAs, I think, are wonderful. For my alma mater, Ohio State needs to schedule Air Force again, and Cornell. I think.
Well, that was the other thing going through the list. I was like, you know what? I wish some of the ADs would go through this and say, you know what, we got to get back to playing an Air Force or playing some of the teams that you would think would be an interesting matchup nowadays.
Yeah. Listen, if you're Rice, under no circumstances should you schedule anybody. You need to claim scoreboard on Alabama until the test of time. You need to make shirts that say, "Why does Rice play Alabama? Because it's easy." And don't mess with any of that. You want to be a 400 level historical program that's undefeated against Alabama and Auburn and Georgia and a whole bunch of other schools. Take that to your grave. Everybody else, avenge your embarrassing losses like Michigan did with Appalachian State. You can find all of that at extrapointsmb.com. We're working on a couple other fun things I'm excited about, or whether that's at the Athletic Director Simulator 3000, which I'm hoping will be ready in a little bit. A couple other more reported NIL stories, some other business things that we're working on that I hope to be able to share soon, and exciting things on this podcast and on Collegiate Sports Connect. So you can find that on Spotify. You can find that on YouTube. You can find that on Collegiate Sports Connect's free. All of our stuff's over there. A lot of the athletic director interviews I did at Lead One are now uploaded. You can see those, and we'll be back in touch with you on the internet again very soon. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you soon.